Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better? Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Hosmer, professor and head of the OSU History Department, and your host for this episode. So we're joined today by Dr. Douglas Miller, associate professor in our history department. Dr. Miller is an accomplished scholar, teacher, and departmental citizen, rightly honored with university awards for excellence in the classroom, as a researcher, and as an advisor, mentor, and director of our graduate program. His scholarship pivots around 20th century indigenous communities in North America, with a particular focus on urbanization, culture, music, and the long history of incarceration. He's written the groundbreaking book, Indians on the Move, about Native peoples and cities, and is currently completing Washington Lovechild, The Life and Times of Jesse Ed Davis, the first biography of this Native American rock star. I'm sure we'll talk about those projects and much more over the next hour or so. Welcome to Good History, Doug.
Thank you.
And let me begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in Stillwater and at Oklahoma State University.
Well, that's a big question. I took the job here at Oklahoma State in 2015, August 2015, after 1 year on a postdoc down at Southern Methodist University. I'm at the Clement Center for Southwest Studies, where I got a sort of big head start on my book project. Prior to that, I was at the University of Oklahoma, where I earned my PhD and finished there in 2014. So PhD from OU, I work at OSU. That's sometimes confounding to my students. But yeah, I'm a OSU cowboy. My loyalty is here, and I work for our great university. But I had a great experience studying history at OU for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014. Prior to that, I was at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I earned a master's degree. And before that, I was at Minnesota, the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, where I earned a BA in history and American Indian Studies. That's kind of my academic trajectory, but that's not maybe a great answer to the question. How did I end up here? I love history. I like good history too. And at some point, I had decided that I wanted to see if I could commit my life to it. And it worked. And, that's why I'm here.
Awesome. I think it might be safe to observe that your background is atypical for university professors, or perhaps I'm saying that because we assume something about university professors and assume a uniformity of background. Nevertheless, right, I think we have a sense that, right, atypical background. You've had other lives, I think it's safe to say. So what was it about history? You just started referring to this that drew you away from those paths and toward this one. How did history play a role in these kinds of shifting lives?
Yeah. Well, I have had a pretty diverse range of experiences in my life. I knew that I was interested in history as early as like 5th, 6th grade in elementary school. And then I kind of learned in junior high and high school that I was good at history, and that's different than being interested in it. I was eventually, fast forward to Minneapolis. I had moved up there in 2001. I think it's a little foggy now, to play music primarily. I was in a working group at the time, and we were recording for a record label based up in Duluth, Minnesota. We wanted to be kind of closer to the label and closer to a vibrant music scene, which Minneapolis and St. Paul certainly offer. I was going to the University of Minnesota kind of on the side. I was really playing music by night, and I was working for a major shipping company by day, so much so that I ultimately became AM operations manager. This was after, running routes and driving forklift and kind of, working my way up the chain of command there. And history was not an afterthought for me. I was just enrolled as a history major because I didn't really know what else to do going to college. I knew again that I was good at history and I had some interest there, but I wasn't a great student at first because I was more devoted to music and I was working a lot too. So my junior year at Minnesota, I took a Native American philosophy course. And just in the way that students take courses for diversity credits and things of that nature, it kind of jumped out at me as something maybe I was interested in. And that course kind of turned my whole sort of sense of the world and how the world worked and who people are and a kind of logic about the natural world and history and culture and society, and exposed me to a lot of things that for the first time in my life were as exciting and interesting to me as music. And I started taking every Native American studies course, Native history course I possibly could in my final 2 years at Minnesota. And the rest is history. I broke up my band. I left a good paying morning job and I moved to Chicago to see if I could do something with this thing I'd been doing for a long time, but never in a kind of devoted way that had finally occurred to me.
So when I listen to that, I'm hearing that you have this life, you're playing music, you're in Minnesota to play music, and then you're taking classes, you're making money on the side, and then something happens in this class that shifts your frame of thinking. And you just described that really, really well, but I wanted to sort of think about this when you were becoming more interested in history, or that part of your brain was awakening. Did that change the way you looked at your music career?
Yeah, absolutely. The group that I was playing with had done pretty well. We toured the country 10 or 11 times. We had made 4 records. I was at a point where I was feeling pretty happy with what we had achieved, while simultaneously gaining a sense that we might have hit our ceiling in terms of where we could go with music. So the history thing, Native American studies, it intersected with a moment in my life where I thought maybe it was time to explore something new. And again, I always come back to this idea that I had never felt a sort of enthusiasm that I did relative to my relationship with music as I did when I started learning Native American history. And I was kind of ready for a change. Now, the question is the relationship between Native American history and what I had experienced in music to that point?
It was just more thinking about, more general than that, thinking about as the history part of the Native American Studies part grows and you're looking back on the music part and how it looks different to you. And you kind of were describing that, but we think about how these different parts of our lives intersect. And sometimes when you have a new interest or a new enthusiasm, it's not that you reject what you're doing, you sort of see it maybe differently.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question for me to think about. And I think my answer to it is that I didn't see music differently. Quite the opposite. And now maybe we're sort of onto something, or this is sort of a light bulb going off, or I'm reflecting on my own past here. I didn't see music differently. I saw history and what I could do with it as an extension of what I had done as a musician and what attracted me to playing music and living a life that was about creativity and artistic expression and a kind of freedom that comes with that and a kind of soulfulness that comes with that and a kind of personal experience and journey that comes with that. I kind of almost immediately saw something in history that reflected all of that and that I could kind of map or project or extend my experiences in music into the world of history. Now, at the same time, I also don't really know what I'm talking about. If we go back to 2005, 2006, I have no idea what a professional career in history is going to entail. I remember, and this is quite serious and quite true. I remember going to my Native American history professor's office, and we were chatting after class. I was one of those students. I always needed to learn more. I needed to know more about today's lecture. And at one point, she stopped me and said, "Doug, you should go to graduate school." And I said, "What's graduate school?" Quite seriously. And if I knew anything about that, I thought that's like what doctors, physicians and lawyers do. I had no real sense of that. I didn't come up in a family with anyone who had ever gone to graduate school. I didn't really know anything in terms of the business side of the profession or how things work. But I saw in my professors and I saw in the work that I was reading that a lot of what I love about music could be kind of replicated in the history world. And, I can certainly elaborate on that. But, one thought that comes to mind is, at one time, I think I was a musician posing as a history student. And, now I'm a professional historian and I still play music, but I'm a sort of a historian posing as a musician now. But they're intertwined now, quite seriously, not as a sort of jokey aside. I don't see them as different and separate at all. And I can elaborate on that.
Well, I asked that because you and I have known each other for a long time. And I remember early on in our association in Chicago, I asked you, when I started knowing a little bit about you, why you wanted to be an historian. And I knew that you'd been in a band and we'd already talked about music, or we'd started speaking about that, sharing ideas. And you said something that no student had ever said to me, which was, I was looking for a creative outlet that was more sustainable for me than music. And I think I found that in history. And I found that a remarkable answer, and it speaks to what you were just describing right now.
I remember saying that. That's right. Yeah, the music that I was playing, the group that I was working with, we were great. I'm so proud of what I did for several years with my life. And we didn't lose money. We made a little money on it. We did all right. And at the same time, there was a sense that, I don't know if it's sustainable going forward. And we're also in the middle of the internet revolution affecting the music industry. Things were changing rapidly, and the way that I sort of understood what it meant to be a professional musician and how to do it was changing and was not getting away from me or our group. I mean, we could have kind of transitioned into that new world, but I wasn't really sure that's what I liked about music anymore, as it sort of went on to the internet. So history kind of comes in and fills some of that void. And in every respect, I mean, teaching is a gig. I mean, I just did this morning. I get to go in front of 100, 200, sometimes as many as 300 students, and really try to have some kind of communal experience with them and inspire them to feel something deeply on some kind of, soulful level. I could do that in music and I can do that in history now. And I look forward to it. I still, to this day, so many years in, I'll wake up in the morning when I'm teaching and I got a gig today. And I'm kind of excited. Like, what am I going to wear? And what are we going to talk about? And, like all the kind of exciting things about knowing you have a gig that night. And we go to conferences and they're kind of like music festivals and all the big acts are there, and they're so-and-so. I like their record, right? But I like their book.
Yeah.
And, making books and publications and research is a lot like making records. If you got a producer in the music world, now you got an editor in the book world. And just like an album, your book's got a cover and the chapter's like a song, and there's going to be some editing and some making these creative projects that are going to go out into the world. And you kind of anxiously, wow, I hope people like it. I don't know. And I could just sort of go on and on with that. Publishers are a lot like record labels in many respects. So again, I don't look back and think that there was a real break in my life. I think a lot of what I experienced in music helped me understand how history was going to work and what it could mean to me, even as I needed to sort of go through a learning curve.
Yeah. I love that. That's really, really awesome. So I want to kind of stay with this thread a little bit and kind of riff on our relationship a little bit. And I, as we're sort of walking through this, we know each other pretty well. And I know about your diverse interests, and we've covered a lot of ground together. I also know that you're a music collector.
Yeah.
And so and you're a collector of LPs primarily. And I'd kind of like to talk with you about that. And we'll start sort of with an easy one. How many LPs do you own?
Yeah, that's not an easy one. Not as many as you might think. I have around 700 or 800 LPs. I don't know if that's as many as if that sounds like a lot to people. And then about 500 CDs and just thousands and thousands of albums digitally and songs digitally and so forth. My LP collection is not, now I know it's like some people 700 or 800. What? There are people that have upward of 20, 30, 40,000, right?
Indeed.
So that's not that much to some people, but my collection is curated. It's all killer, no filler. I don't have just sort of rough copies of records that I never listened to. And I have a lot of collectible stuff and stuff that I really try to build a kind of total statement with what I have. Yeah.
So you think about it in that way. Do you organize them topically by genre? Are they alphabetized?
It's just alphabetized. Yeah. Because I know where everything is. Yeah.
So that's what's really interesting, right? Because we think about another intersection between music and history, and it's the archive.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're kind of talking about an archive and the way you imagine it and organize it. And you just sort of talked a little bit about how selective you are in a certain way, or you use the word curated, right? So maybe talk to us a little bit more, right, about curating a record collection, curating a music collection. What is it that draws you? You mentioned, I like collectible things. Well, that's a really big, that's a pretty broad term. What do you mean by that? And how does that matter to you?
Good, nice copies of records that I really love. So I don't just collect to sort of show them off. And this one is worth $320 currently. And this one, this is music that means a lot to me. I mean, my music collection is like a photo album. I don't have a journal or a diary or really keep a photo album or anything of that nature. And I didn't really grow up in a family where I learned much about sort of who I was and where I came from. And I don't have a stuff from my family to sort of, so somewhere along the line, I started to realize, and this wasn't strategic, therefore, and sort of premeditated. I realized, this record collection, this is my stuff. This is who I am. And now, God forbid, my son or whomever, well, my son loves music, so that wasn't going to work. I was going to say, you're going to get stuck with 600 LPs or something. Like, I got to carry around 300 pounds of records because my dad's soul is in this collection or something. He'll probably like that based on what I know about him. But it's another example of how music to me is not something different from what I've done with history. It's just one extension. They serve each other, and they're all the same song, right? To use an old sort of folk music analogy, it's all one song. When I was a kid, I started collecting music very early. In first grade, I bought my first 45, and then my first like full LP in second grade. And that was after initially going through my mom and dad's kind of small record collection in the closet, like Kiss and Bob Seger and the Cars and stuff like that. And I was just fascinated by this stuff. In terms of just the physical objects, like an old gatefold album that you open up and you see all the artwork and all the imagery, and there's a story in there, and there are all these people's names, and I'm like, who are these people? Where do they come from? Right. And what is this about? And I grew up in, I won't overshare, but I'll say there's some tough stuff that happened in my home growing up. And my record collection was something that I could kind of dive into as an escape. And curating, I'm doing that on some level in third grade with my big tape case that I got from selling chocolate bars for the school fundraiser and just kind of working my cassettes. And this goes here and this goes there. And at a very young age, I really would kind of lose myself in album covers and cassette covers and studying these things as a way to, I think, introduce a little organization into a home life that felt a little chaotic sometimes. Mm-hmm. And there's a therapeutic element to it that's always stuck with me. Now, I could keep going on about that, but getting up to history now and the connections, the overlap or the through line, all that stuff lent well to becoming a history student. To go to the library and just to sit and pull books down, right? Native American history, right? E91, 92, 93, and I'm up there. And I'm doing the same thing that I would do with records when I was a kid. Who's this?
Right.
Where do they come from? What's this story? Right? Who's this publisher? That's like the record label. What is the University of Nebraska Press? What's their angle? And then I'm interested I want to learn all the kind of genealogy of this stuff, just like I did with music. And now I'm into who's this person's advisor? Who's that producer? Right. And all that stuff that I loved about music, again, maps onto my love of history in the same way. So going to a record store, thumbing through the vinyl bins, which I know is a thing that, we kind of mock that as sort of some kind of hipster endeavor.
I don't mock it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. For me, it's an archival
It was
thing.
great. Yeah.
It's a search.
Yeah.
And it's fun. And you always have that one thing in mind that you're looking for, and that same thing ends up happening with history.
Right.
Going into the archive and you start going through halogen boxes of documents and what's this? Who's this? What does this mean? What is this about? And just kind of putting all that together is a very enriching experience and a very soulful experience.
Yeah. Yeah. No, don't mock the flipping through the record bins or the hours studying the album covers. Was one of the things I liked about the LPs, and I would be immersed in them too and finding the connections that, oh, this guy was also on that record over there. And then you start getting even deeper into the producers, right? Well, this person produced these. So it's like the same kind of process that we go through history. So I think that's great. So let's talk a little bit more about, kind of keep working on this, I guess, a little bit. And I want to talk about Jesse Ed Davis.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell us a little bit about him, his life, and what attracted you to this project.
Well, Jesse Ed Davis was a Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, Muskogee, and Seminole person from Oklahoma, from right here in Oklahoma. In fact, I was just listening to a song of his this morning. He talks about my Oklahoma home. I've kind of been singing that in my head all day. And speaking of that, if it's not too much of a digression, what else, like music and history, how else do they work together? They make me at home here in Oklahoma. This is where my professional career is going to be. I get the job offer here at Oklahoma State, and I'm going to go here. And I'd already been in Oklahoma for 5 years as a doctoral student. Now I'm going to go here. How do I find myself in this place, and how can I belong in Oklahoma? And who are my people? Well, there's the academic world, right? I'm going to work with all my academic colleagues, but the music here really made me, find a home here and sort of become an Okie. Now I digress. Jesse Ed Davis, he was an Oklahoman, Native American musician, born in Norman, Oklahoma, but raised in Oklahoma City. And he was like the only Native American kid in his middle-class neighborhood in high school growing up. And he had some challenges because of that, growing up at that time in the 1950s. And he wanted to be a rock and roller. He wanted to be a sort of, in his words, a real authentic blues man. And his dad played in a jazz band, kind of moonlighted as a jazz drummer. And Jesse kind of grew up around music, formed some high school bands, played with Conway Twitty a little bit when he was in college at the University of Oklahoma, back when Twitty was more of a rockabilly guy than a country guy, and got some chops there. And eventually in 1967, he sets up in Los Angeles, staying at his grandfather's house in Silver Lake. His grandfather had worked in Hollywood for years. And Jesse tries his hand at a serious career in music, and it works. He goes on to play with Bob Dylan and Taj Mahal and John Lennon and George Harrison, Leon Russell, and all kinds of luminaries in rock and blues and jazz and country and pop history. For about 20 years, he had an incredible career as a musician, and later in life played with a really prominent Native American activist and poet named John Trudell, and made kind of a new music form, if you will, a kind of new kind of indigenous rock music. Toward the end of his spoken word, all kinds of interesting beats and instrumentation and lyrics and really politically charged stuff, and a really extraordinary life that ended a little too soon, but nevertheless really made his mark in terms of, I think, Native American history and music history in two prominent realms. So my attraction to it, you asked. Well, the theme, I think, of our talk so far has been a relationship between music and maybe Native American history. And there we have it in one person's life. And for me, in one project, kind of rolled into one. So speaking about going home or coming home or finding home, this really jumped out at me as a next book project that would take me back into the world of music that I was missing a little bit
Yeah.
after a few years being away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, connecting these threads, and when you deliver a lecture or when you write a song to perform it, maybe particularly performing it, you have in your mind, in some sense, some vague vision of what it is that you want people to receive
Mm.
and the experience that they may want, whether it's your students or your audience. So when you imagine an audience for the Jesse Ed book, what is it that you want them to experience?
A lot. Because it's been a lot for me. So I want that for others too. On one hand, it's just fun music. It's good time music. I've used the word soulful too many times in our conversation, but it is just really soulful music. And I want people to know that there was a prominent Native American musician who really influenced the sound of popular music for about 20 years. And he hasn't quite been acknowledged to the degree that he should. So there's a general, I think this person is important. And also in terms of being a Native American historical subject, I think he's important for all kinds of reasons that maybe I'll sort of pause there for a second on that note. I want people to know that Native American people have always shaped, influenced, produced, made, experienced, danced to, listened to, critiqued, bought, anything that we can think of with music. Native people have always been a part of that. Jesse Davis is just one example, but I think he's a really rich example. And I think that through his life, you can learn a little bit about Native American history that you might not otherwise see. And you might hear some music that you might not otherwise pick up. And all that kind of gets rolled into one.
That's cool. So this has been a big undertaking, this project, and kind of both consistent with what you're doing, but also a bit of a departure in some ways, kind of a different kind of writing and a different kind of approach to it. So has this project, now that you're nearing the completion, kind of changed the way that you look at yourself as an historian and look at your relationship to your craft?
Yes, I think so. But I'm not sure how yet or why yet. I think that I'm always kind of ruminating on all of that. Not because I, predicted that you would ask me this question today, but it's something that happens naturally working on a project like this. It's a very personal project in many ways. I didn't know Jesse Ed Davis personally. I never met him, although I know a lot about him. It may be too much.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
In terms of like thinking about what it means to be a historian and the kinds of projects we do, this was completely different than anything else I'd ever experienced. It was much more challenging than anything else I'd ever done. And on one hand, it's about music, and that's fun for me. And I got to interview a lot of interesting people, and it took me some interesting places. And it was way more complicated, way more challenging than anything else I've ever done. To write about one person's life in great depth and great detail, you start to develop a sense of responsibility to this subject on another level that can cause all kinds of turmoil is too strong of a word, but a lot of feelings, about your responsibility for a subject, your relationship to a person's life. I might know more about Jesse Ed Davis than anyone else in the world.
Wow.
I mean, even people who played with him or family or friends that I've spoken with, they'll often kind of interrupt and like, I'm learning so much from you. I didn't know any of this, and I can't believe what you know. Talking to people like Taj Mahal, who are really close with them, and that has a strange effect,
I would imagine,
on you a little bit. Like, why do I know all this?
Right.
Who am I?
Right.
Why should I know all this stuff? And what now responsibility do I carry as a result? But I bring a lot of myself to the project too. In some ways, this book is a reflection of my own life in many respects, a life in music. And it's kind of about me in the sense that it's about a deep devotion to music and artistry and expression that I think has characterized my life. Yeah. I hope so. Yeah. Anyway, so relationship to the project and what it means to be a historian, the personal dimension of it, the intimate dimension of it, and a sense of when this goes out into the world, November 12th this year, I still don't know how I'm going to feel about that.
Yeah, I would imagine. Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's really fascinating, and I think I can well imagine. So, I want to think a little bit about how you choose topics. We talked a little bit about Jesse Ed Davis, but your research is focused in the 20th century primarily, maybe a little bit the 20th century, but mostly the 20th century. And that's really interesting, specifically with reference to Native American studies. And here we are, a quarter of the way into the 21st century. And yet, most of what's written about Native peoples is located prior to 1900.
Yeah.
And here you are, right, working strongly in the 20th century. Why?
That's where I came into the subject. Back at Minnesota, I was interested in urban indigenous communities. I was interested in the American Indian movement because it was founded in Minneapolis and St. Paul in 1968. And because of my interest in the American Indian movement, I got to know a lot of people involved in AIM and used to attend their meetings. Like the only non-native guy at these meetings, sitting shoulder to shoulder with some of the founders of the movement. I met a lot of people from the Twin Cities Native community and worked with them a little bit in some capacity. So the people I knew were contemporary people. And I was interested in their stories. Well, just like with the music. Well, who are they and where do they come from? What is their life about? And that just kind of naturally led me into the interests that have so far defined my scholarly interests. Yeah, I don't think, looking back, it was again a kind of strategic thing where, well, there aren't enough people doing this, so I should. I didn't know that at the time. I hadn't read enough. I didn't know what I was talking about yet. I just knew that I know these people and I'm interested in their lives. And I wanted to learn more about that. And when I got to Chicago, I quickly understood there's a very significant Native community here, and there
Indeed.
long has been. And well, what's that about?
Right.
And where do the people come from? And what are their lives like? And what should we and should we not know?
Mhm.
So wherever I've gone, I wanted to know something about the place. I have an article about Indigenous Dallas because I was there for 1 year, and I felt a responsibility. If I'm going to be here, I want to know something about the subject. So that's just always been more recent kind of stuff I've been interested in as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just really interesting to think, right? Because we have this rich 20th century and 21st century, and most of the scholarship and Indians are mostly situated in the past. And I think that's really interesting.
It's
phenomenon.
frustrating.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. There's so much that happens in the 20th century that now I'm doing that. Well, no one's done this yet, so somebody should. There's just so much that we haven't wrapped our heads around yet.
Yeah.
And I think Native people have been trying to tell us.
Indeed.
For a long time. And I would really like to see our academic field catch up a little bit, or start to hear those messages a little bit.
I think this moves to sort of questions of the uses and importance of history, or the way we kind of think about maybe the responsibilities of history to communicate outside of our world. And these days, in the first quarter of the 21st century, history and the humanities are struggling to demonstrate our relevance and importance to college students and certainly the public at large, right? We know this. This is a longstanding conversation. We're told that focusing on history in college, let's say as a major, is a bad career move, and told that history majors mostly end up as baristas. Now, I like good coffee and don't have a problem with baristas, so let's be really clear about that. But you get the point. At the same time, Americans consume history enthusiastically.
Yes.
They buy books, lots of them. Watch documentaries, tons of them. Enjoy feature films set in historical periods, including the most recent, the award-winning Oppenheimer film, right? Lots of history. So Americans love history. They consume history. They think about it. In fact, Americans, all of us, appeal to history all the time. Think of any kind of debate or conversation that we may have or we may observe on contemporary issues, and almost invariably, some version of, well, history tells us, right,
Mm.
is the default answer, right? So you will appeal to history in order to prove your point. Again, the importance of history, right, in our daily lives, part of our kind of mental framework, and even the way that we interact with one another is through this sort of historical lens. So, what do we make about this paradox? History struggling for oxygen inside the academy, the place where we work, and its popularity outside the walls of the academy. What do you think about that paradox in our time?
A lot. I suspect a lot of people don't recognize what you just articulated, that history is happening all around them, that their lives are engaged with history, invested with history, whether they want them to be or not, or whether they know that or not, and maybe don't even recognize kind of in the moment. I mean, on some artificial level, yeah, Oppenheimer, a historical, well, yeah, it's set during the World War II and Cold War period, and it's about this and that. But I don't think that people who see that make the connection that there's something happening in a history classroom somewhere that's kind of like this in some exciting ways. One answer to the question is I just don't think enough people realize that history is a part of their lives, as you just suggested, and they need to be kind of awakened to that. And then from there, if there's an awakening, it can be scary, right? It can be scary.
Right.
It takes courage
Yes.
to learn about history. And then it takes even more courage to reflect on your own life relative to what you just learned.
Indeed.
You got to be fearless to engage with history. And somebody who isn't quite prepared for that might recoil initially. It's like a lot of things in life where this is going to take a little part of you, but you're going to get something back. And I think people don't necessarily want to engage with that or activate that part of their thinking or their soul or their heart, right? And finally, I just think a lot of people don't know what we do.
Yeah.
Frankly,
Right.
they don't know what history really is. And I think that because students tell me all the time, they tell me after the end of the semester, I just didn't know this is what this class was going to be. I love it.
Yeah.
I had no idea. And so now I've become pretty choreographed or scripted in terms of the first day, trying to disabuse students of the idea that we're not just going to like learn the presidents in order and learn dates, this kind of trivia.
Right.
That's trivia. That's not history.
Right.
That's trivia. Those are different things. They don't know what we do.
Right.
There are some initial challenges there in just getting people to realize what history can be worth to them and to all of us, right? And then getting them to make that kind of leap of faith with us. But more people need to know what we do. It's not what they think.
It's definitely not what they think. And I think you're right that people are living and talking about and breathing history all the time and don't know it.
Yeah.
Or don't think about it, right? And that they're living, right? And history is happening all around them in really exciting ways and also kind of moors us in a certain way. You're talking about the disruptive part of history, but it also anchors us in our place, right? In all kinds of ways. And that's not just, that could be one's personal history, but it could also just be sort of like world events that anchor people. They'll say, well, I remember this, and I remember there was this time before that big event, and now there's sort of a lot of that I find really fascinating, and that this sort of conversation about history, and in some ways, it's often sometimes even historiographical, right? Different ways of looking at history is just interwoven in the way that we speak with one another in really fascinating ways, right? But maybe subconscious, invisible, subterranean, but it's there all the time. I'm really struck by that. So we're just about done, but I have one last question for you that actually builds off of this. And all of us are historians when we go to the dentist or get our hair cut, people ask you questions about history. Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're often similar and located in certain places, but nevertheless, there are, and this is a way for people to engage with. Also speaks to what I just said. You're an historian. I want to talk to you about history.
Yeah.
And so if you could flip the script.
Yeah.
And you're at a party, you're at the dentist, you're at getting your hair cut, and rather than that person asking you a question, you could sort of feed the question or kind of orchestrate that interaction, what kind of question would you want that person to ask you?
What would I want them to ask me? Speaking earlier in our conversation about music and reading history books and this fascination with who are these people and where do they come from? That's the question to turn back on ourselves now. And that's what making a leap of faith is about. And that's where the courage comes in. That's where the responsibility comes in. That's where the discipline comes in. That's where the power comes in when we turn that question back on ourselves. And that's what history is worth. And that's what people don't know what we're doing in our work and in our classrooms and the kinds of experiences students might have. It's that part where, and then somebody asks you, right? And they ask, who are you and where do you come from? That to me is the starting place for everything.
Yeah.
That's why we should know history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we think in terms of our families, everybody wants to know who they are and where they come from. And you asked me at the beginning, how'd you end up in Stillwater?
Right.
Well, that's where everything begins. How did you get here?
Exactly.
And that's the kind of thing I might like to be asked, because then somewhere in the question is going to come the kind of substantive history stuff about, I grew up in corn country in Illinois and Iowa, and my family worked for John Deere. And I experienced deindustrialization firsthand growing up. And and it's sort of, now I'm talking about like actual historical events and themes and things that happened by virtue of being asked about who I am and where I come from. That to me is the beginning of all history.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I want to thank you for exploring good history with us today, Doug. I really appreciate it. And our tagline, our ending line is remember that the only bad history is the history we don't know, right? So maybe that's one way to look at this. I'm Brian Hosmer. On behalf of my colleague, Sarah Griswold, our excellent producer, Jesse Ulrich, our stellar researcher, Christina Rogers, and the OSU History Department, which supports this program, thank you for guiding us through some good history.
Thank you.